A blind baby, presumed dead, disappears without a trace. Years later, a wild horse starts acting strangely, leading to a discovery that will change everything. The wind blew fiercely along the cliffs of Harbour Point, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of sea spray. Matthew Silver, at 25 years old, walked with confident steps along the trail he knew by heart. His eyes, as blue as the sea he had never seen, couldn't perceive the world around him, but his other senses captured every detail with impressive precision. The sea is rough today, he thought, as his ears detected the sound of waves crashing furiously against the rocks. His fingers glided gently along the stone walls, recognizing each texture, each shape sculpted by time. In the distance, he heard the familiar whinny. He smiled involuntarily. "Shadow, my old friend. Always nearby, aren't you?" The black horse, wild and mysterious, known to everyone in town but tamed by no one, seemed to have an inexplicable connection with Matthew. For as long as he could. Remember, the animal had been present at crucial moments in his life like a silent guardian. "Matthew! Matthew!" Nancy Cooper's voice echoed along the path, interrupting his thoughts. "Come back home, son. Someone wants to speak with you." Nancy Cooper, the woman who had raised him as her own son, approached breathlessly. At 68, she still maintained the energy of someone much younger, but her voice carried a note of concern that didn't go unnoticed by Matthew. "Who is it, Mum?" he asked, turning toward her voice. "Mrs. Diane Blackwell." Matthew felt a shiver run down his spine. The matriarch of the most powerful family in the region rarely left her mansion on top of the hill, and never visited the simple house where he lived with Nancy. "What does she want with me?" "I don't know, son. She wouldn't tell me. She just asked to speak with you, privately." The walk back was silent. Matthew could feel the tension emanating from Nancy, who gripped his arm more tightly than usual. He recognized that grip. It was the same one she used when, as a child, she protected him from intrusive questions about his blindness or his origins. When they reached the small blue wooden house, the smell of expensive perfume invaded his nostrils. Diane Blackwell exuded power and elegance at 75, sitting erect in the living room chair as if it were a throne. "Matthew Silver," her voice was firm, almost musical. "We finally meet." "Mrs. Blackwell," Matthew inclined his head slightly. "In respect, to what do I owe the honor?" "Nancy, dear, would you please excuse us?" The request sounded like an order. Matthew heard Nancy's hesitant footsteps moving away, then the sound of the kitchen door closing. "I've brought something that belongs to you," Diane said, and Matthew heard the noise of something being placed on the table. "A box I've kept for many years, waiting for the right moment." Matthew extended his hands, touching an old wooden box. His fingers traced familiar carvings, symbols that seemed to awaken dormant memories. "These symbols," he murmured, furrowing his brow. "I know them, but I don't know from where." "They're the same ones engraved on the medallion you wear around your neck," replied Diane. "The medallion that was with you when you were found." Matthew instinctively touched the small object he never removed, hidden beneath his shirt. How could she know? "Open the box, Matthew. It's time for you to learn the truth about who you really are." With trembling fingers, he unlocked the box. The smell of old paper filled the air. Diane guided his hand to the documents inside. "What are these papers?" he asked, feeling the yellowed texture beneath his fingers. "The story they tried to erase," answered Diane, her voice suddenly laden with emotion. "The story of how Gilbert Blackwell, my own son, tried to eliminate you when you were just a baby." At that moment, a powerful whinny sounded from outside, so loud it made the windows of the house shake. Shadow was there, as if he knew exactly what was happening. "And why would he do that?" asked Matthew, his heart racing. "Because you, Matthew Silver, are the legitimate heir to the most valuable lands in Harbour Point, lands that hide a treasure many would kill to possess." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Matthew remained motionless, Diane Blackwell's words echoing in his mind like waves crashing against the cliffs. Outside, Shadow continued to whinny, as if confirming every word spoken. What do you mean, heir? Matthew finally found his voice. Nancy always told me I was found abandoned. Diane sighed deeply. Nancy protected you the only way she could. She paused, carefully choosing her words. You weren't simply abandoned, Matthew. You were thrown from the cliff so you wouldn't survive. The room seemed to spin around Matthew. His hand clutched the medallion beneath his shirt so tightly his knuckles turned white. Who am I then? He asked in a whisper. You are the son of Claire. Silver, a brilliant scientist who studied medicinal plants on the cliffs. Diane's voice trembled slightly. And of Gilbert Blackwell, my son. Matthew felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Gilbert Blackwell, the feared and respected businessman, owner of half the town, was his father. The same man everyone whispered was cruel and merciless. That stormy night, 25 years ago, continued Diane, Claire had discovered something extraordinary on the lands that belonged to her family. Something that could change the world and, most importantly, could restore your sight. My sight. Matthew instinctively brought his hands to his face. What do you mean? The golden bromeliad. A rare plant that grows only on the cliffs of Harbor Point, with medicinal properties that could revolutionize neurological treatments. Claire was about to publish her research when Diane's voice faltered. When what? Pressed Matthew. When? She mysteriously disappeared, and you, her newborn baby, were reported missing. At that moment, Nancy entered the room, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. I worked for the Blackwell family, Nancy confessed. The night it all happened, I heard Gilbert order his henchman, Jacob, to take the baby to the cliffs and... She couldn't complete the sentence. But how did I survive? Asked Matthew, his breathing accelerated. It was Shadow, answered Nancy with a sad smile. Nobody knows where that horse came from, but that night he appeared at the top of the cliffs, whinnying so loudly he woke all the fishermen in the village. They followed the sound until they found you, miraculously alive among the rocks, protected by a ledge. Your fall was cushioned by bushes, but the impact damaged your optic nerve. Matthew felt hot tears running down his face. Throughout his life, he had wondered why Shadow seemed to always protect him, why the horse followed him wherever he went. When the fisherman brought you in, I recognized the medallion, continued Nancy. It was identical to the one Claire always... Well, I knew it was you, her son. I asked to take care of you, claiming you were a distant relative. Gilbert never knew you survived. Diane opened the box again, removing more documents. Claire left evidence, Matthew. Maps of the areas where the golden bromeliad grows, research results, and more importantly, documents proving those lands legally belong to the Silver family. The same lands where Gilbert plans to build the Blue Coast project, added Nancy. A resort that will completely destroy the natural habitat of the bromeliad. The sound of a car braking abruptly outside interrupted the conversation. Hurried footsteps approached, and the door opened with a bang. A woman of approximately 40, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and intensely green eyes, entered the room breathlessly. Mrs. Blackwell, we need to leave now, she said, urgency in her voice. Gilbert discovered you're here. Matthew, this is Ellen Silver, Diane introduced quickly. Your aunt Claire's sister. She's been working undercover in Gilbert's companies for years, monitoring his movements. My aunt? Matthew extended his hand, trembling. Ellen squeezed his hand firmly, and Matthew felt an immediate connection. The same finger shape, the same temperature of the skin. We don't have time for proper introductions now, nephew, said Ellen, her voice firm but emotional. Gilbert has scheduled the official announcement of the resort construction for tomorrow. If he discovers you're alive and the legitimate heir to the lands... A furious whinny from Shadow cut through the night, followed by the sound of more cars. Approaching. Too late, muttered Ellen, running to the window. They're here. Through the back, quickly, ordered Nancy, pulling Matthew by the arm. The modest house had an exit through the back that led to a trail hidden among the vegetation. As they moved quickly through the darkness, the headlights of cars illuminated the front of the house. The box, remembered Matthew, trying to go back. I've got it, assured Ellen, quickening her pace. We need to reach Rebecca's laboratory before they find us. Rebecca Martin, the professor? Asked Matthew, surprised. She was a close friend of your mother, explained Diane. Her breath labored from the effort of keeping pace. She continued Claire's research in secret all these years. They advanced along the trail that Matthew knew so well even in darkness. Suddenly the sound of hooves resounded nearby, and Shadow appeared beside them, whinnying softly. He wants us to follow him, said Matthew with certainty. Shadow knows a safer path. Without question, the group changed direction, following the majestic black horse through rocks and dense vegetation. Behind them, raised voices and flashlights indicated that Gilbert's men had discovered the escape and begun the pursuit. After 20 tense minutes of walking, they reached a small structure camouflaged among the rocks, partially hidden by common bromeliads, a small scientific observatory disguised as a fisherman's shelter. Rebecca Martin, a 60-year-old woman with curly grey hair and astute eyes, opened the door before they even knocked. "I've been expecting you," she said, her gaze quickly assessing the exhausted group. "Gilbert's men are everywhere tonight." Inside the improvised laboratory, modern scientific equipment contrasted with the external simplicity of the building. On the walls, detailed maps of the cliffs and photographs of various plant species filled every available space. "Matthew," Rebecca approached, touching his face with her calloused hands. "The last time I saw you, you were just a baby in Claire's arms. You knew my mother. It wasn't a question, but an emotional statement." "Claire was my best friend and the most brilliant scientist I've ever known," replied Rebecca, guiding him to a chair. "We were together when she discovered the properties of the golden bromeliad." Rebecca walked to a locked cabinet, and after entering a combination, removed a small pot containing an extraordinary plant. Even under the artificial light, the bromeliad emitted a soft glow, its petals of an intense gold reflecting like precious metal. "This is one of the last ones," she explained, "cultivated from seeds that Claire hid before disappearing." Matthew extended his hand, delicately touching the plant. A unique, sweet aroma invaded his nostrils, awakening a distant and hazy memory. A baby cradled in loving arms, the same perfume surrounding him. "I remember this smell," he whispered, incredulous. "Olfactory memory is the most powerful," confirmed Rebecca, emotional. "Claire always took you with her while she worked." Ellen placed the box on the table and opened it carefully. Among the documents was an old flash drive. "Everything we need to stop Gilbert is here," she said, connecting the device to a computer. Claire not only documented her scientific discoveries, but also gathered evidence of Gilbert's illicit activities. On sound, the screen appeared clearly tampered property documents, compromising emails and, most shocking, a video dated 25 years ago. Rebecca hesitated before playing it. "Are you sure you want to see this, Matthew?" "I can't see, but I need to hear," he replied, determined. The video showed a younger Gilbert Blackwell arguing with a rugged-looking man in his office. "I don't care how you do it, Jacob. That baby needs to disappear." Claire was already enough of a problem with her ridiculous ideas of making the plant's properties public. If they discover we have a son, he could claim the lands in the future. "But sir, it's your own son. He's just a bastard who could interfere with my business. The silver lands will be mine, and the Blue Coast project will transform this backwater into a gold mine. Do what needs to be done. Tonight." Silence weighed in the room after the end of the video. Matthew's hands were trembling. "Now we have proof," said Diane, her voice choked with shame for her son's crimes. "We can stop him." "It's not that simple," interrupted Rebecca. "Gilbert is powerful and has the local police in his pocket. We need a plan." A noise from outside alerted the group. Shadow whinnied in warning, moving restlessly near the window. "They found us," whispered Ellen, quickly turning off the lights. "This way," whispered Rebecca, pressing a hidden mechanism that revealed a narrow passage in the back wall of the laboratory. Claire built this emergency exit when she began to suspect Gilbert's intentions. One by one, they entered the dark tunnel. Rebecca closed the passage behind them. At the exact moment, the main door was broken down. Heavy footsteps and harsh voices invaded the space they had just left. "Where does this tunnel lead?" asked Matthew, feeling the moisture of the stone walls beneath his fingers. To a cave in the cliffs, replied Rebecca, a place only Claire knew about, or at least that's what we thought. The group advanced with difficulty through the narrow tunnel, illuminated only by the weak light from Ellen's cell phone. After about 200 meters, the path opened into a spacious cave, where the sound of waves echoed softly. "I can't believe it still exists," murmured Diane, amazed. "Claire told me about this place once, but I thought it was just a story." Shatit cave had a natural opening that faced the sea, large enough for small boats to enter. On the walls, improvised shelves held old laboratory equipment and notebooks protected by waterproof covers. "Claire's secret laboratory," explained Rebecca, lighting a larger lantern that illuminated the space. Here she conducted her most sensitive experiments with the golden bromeliad, away from Gilbert's eyes. Matthew approached one of the shelves slowly, as if he could feel the presence of the mother he never knew. His sensitive fingers gently touched the notebooks. "May I?" he asked, holding one of the diaries. "They're yours by right," replied Rebecca gently. Meanwhile, Ellen and Diane checked the cave exit. "The Blue Coast Project launch event is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m., informed Ellen, checking her phone. "All the major investors will be there, along with the national press." "The perfect moment to expose the truth," concluded Diane, determined to correct her son's mistakes. The sound of falling rocks near the tunnel entrance alarmed the group. "They're coming," warned Nancy, fear evident in her voice. "Is there another exit?" asked Matthew, quickly tucking his mother's diary inside his shirt. Rebecca hesitated. "Yes, but it's dangerous. A narrow trail on the side of the cliff that should only be used during daylight." "We have no choice," decided Ellen, collecting the flash drive and the most important documents. "Matthew, you know the cliffs better than anyone, even without sight." "Yes," he agreed, straightening his shoulders. "I can guide you." At that moment, a familiar whinny echoed from outside the cave through the opening facing the sea. "Shadow!" exclaimed Matthew, instinctively moving toward the sound. "How did he get here?" At the cave entrance facing the sea, the imposing black horse was swimming, approaching with determination. Upon reaching the natural stone platform, he shook his wet body and whinnied again, as if calling to them. "He wants us to follow him," realized Matthew. "Shadow knows another way." "But how will we get out? Swimming?" questioned Nancy, concerned. Rebecca illuminated the side wall of the cave, revealing a rudimentary staircase carved into the stone, which climbed to an almost invisible passage. "That way. It leads to an upper trail that goes around the cliff." Claire used it when the tide was high. As they hurriedly climbed, they heard voices approaching through the tunnel. Jacob, Gilbert's former henchman, now an elderly man, was leading the search party. "Empty the place. Take everything you find," he ordered, his hoarse voice echoing off the cave walls. The group barely managed to escape through the upper passage when the men invaded the cave. Outside, the moonless night offered perfect darkness for their escape. Shadow, who had somehow climbed up by another path, was waiting for them at the top of the trail. Guided by the horse and Matthew's unerring memory, they advanced along the dangerous trail on the side of the cliff. The sea wind lashed at their faces, and waves broke violently on the rocks below. "Where are we going?" asked Diane, breathless from the effort. "To the only place we'll be safe tonight," replied Rebecca. "Anthony Fisher's house, the man who found Matthew that stormy night." After almost an hour of tense walking, they reached a small fisherman's house isolated in a protected cove. Before they even approached, the door opened, revealing an elderly man with hair and beard as white as sea foam. "I've been expecting you," he said simply, as if their arrival in the middle of the night was the most natural thing in the world. "The black horse warned me." Matthew felt a strange familiarity with this man he had never met before. "What do you mean, the horse warned you?" he asked, intrigued. Anthony smiled, a smile that only Matthew could sense in the darkness. "Some stories need to be told at the right time, young Matthew," he replied enigmatically. "And I believe that time has finally come." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Anthony Fisher's house was simple but welcoming. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room as the group settled in the living area, illuminated by old lanterns. "You must have many questions," said Anthony, sitting in a worn, rocking chair, the rhythmic creaking of the wood accompanying his words. "How did you know we were coming?" asked Matthew, seated across from him. Anthony sighed deeply. "Shadow has been appearing in my dreams for 3 nights. Always the same dream. The black horse galloping along the beach, stopping in front of my house and looking toward the horizon, in the direction of the cliffs where I found you 25 years ago." Ellen, who was watching through the window, noticed the horse standing like a sentinel near the house. "There's something supernatural about that animal," she commented. "The villagers say Shadow is the embodiment of the protective spirit of the cliffs," explained Anthony. "An old legend tells that when a serious injustice happens on these lands, the spirit returns in the form of a black horse to restore balance." "And you believe that?" asked Diane skeptically. "What I believe doesn't matter, ma'am," replied Anthony calmly. "What matters is that on that stormy night 25 years ago, when everyone was sheltering in their homes, something made me go out and walk to the cliffs." The old fisherman stood with difficulty and walked to an ancient chest. From it, he removed a carefully folded, yellowed infant's shirt. "This was what you were wearing when I found you, Matthew," he said, extending the small piece of fabric. "Soaked by rain and sea, but somehow keeping you alive." Matthew touched the fabric reverently, feeling an immediate connection to his past. "It was Shadow who led me to you," continued Anthony. "His whinnies cut through the storm like a beacon. When I reached the foot of the cliffs, I found him, standing on a ledge, looking fixedly downward, where the waves broke furiously against the rocks." The silence in the room was palpable, everyone absorbed by the story. "It was impossible for a baby to survive such a fall," Anthony went on. "But there you were, protected by a rock formation that seemed to have been sculpted specifically to cushion your fall, with bromeliad bushes around you like a natural cradle." Nancy, who had remained silent until then, wiped away a silent tear. "When Anthony brought you to the village," she interjected, "I immediately recognized the silver medallion. I knew you were Claire's son, but I also knew you would be in danger if Gilbert found out. So you saved me twice," concluded Matthew, gratitude evident in his voice. "First, Anthony pulled me from the rocks. Then you protected me from Gilbert." The D1. Door of the house suddenly opened, startling everyone. An elderly man, bent by years and with a sickly appearance, staggered in, supported by a cane. "Jacob!" exclaimed Diane, recognizing her son's former henchman. Ellen and Rebecca immediately moved into defensive positions, but the man raised his wrinkled hand in a gesture of peace. "I haven't come to harm you," he said in a weak voice. "I've come to do what I should have done 25 years ago. Tell the truth." "How did you find us?" asked Rebecca, suspicious. "I followed you from the cave," he admitted, "but I left the others following a false trail." Matthew stood up, slowly approaching the newcomer. "You were tasked with eliminating me when I was a baby. It wasn't a question, but a statement." Jacob nodded, even knowing Matthew couldn't see the gesture. "Yes," he replied, his voice breaking. "Gilbert ordered me to throw you from the cliffs that stormy night. He said you were a problem that needed to disappear." "But you couldn't complete the task," Matthew continued. Jacob lowered his head, the weight of guilt visible in his hunched shoulders. "I took you to the cliffs as ordered," he confessed, his voice trembling. "The storm was violent, the sea more turbulent than I'd ever seen. When I prepared to throw you, that black horse appeared out of nowhere." Everyone in the room instinctively looked toward the window, where Shadow remained vigilant. He emerged like a ghost in the storm," continued Jacob. "His eyes, they seemed to see into my soul. He whinnied with such fury that it made me step back. You were crying in my arms, and something inside me broke. Tears streamed down the wrinkled face of the man. I didn't have the courage to deliberately throw you, but I also didn't have the courage to save you. I placed you on the ground and fled like a coward." Jacob was visibly shaking now. "All these years I believed you had died on those rocks. The guilt has slowly consumed me." "But he survived," interjected Anthony, "thanks to Shadow." When I learned that Gilbert plans to announce the start of construction tomorrow, I realized I needed to do something before leaving this world, said Jacob, leaning heavily on his cane. Doctors have given me only a few months to live. I can't take this secret with me. From inside his coat, Jacob removed an envelope. My full confession, signed and notarized, he explained, handing the document to Diane. I detail all of Gilbert's crimes that I witnessed, including the attempt to eliminate you, the falsification of documents to take the Silverlands, and the truth about Claire's disappearance. Matthew, who had been silent, absorbing each word, felt his heart accelerate. You know what happened to my mother? A heavy silence took over the room. Jacob passed a trembling hand over his tired face before answering. Claire is no longer in this world, Matthew. His voice was barely a whisper. Gilbert confronted her that night when he discovered she was planning to make public the discovery of the golden bromeliad and reveal that you were his son. Matthew felt the weight of those words like a violent wave breaking against his chest. Even suspecting the truth, hearing it confirmed was devastating. The argument got out of control, continued Jacob. He pushed her during the fight. Claire hit her head on a rock and didn't recover. It was an accident. At least that's what Gilbert always told himself. Nancy sobbed quietly, covering her mouth with her hands. Ellen approached Matthew, holding his arm in silent support. Gilbert panicked, Jacob went on. He ordered me to dispose of the body in the sea and then the baby. 2 problems solved at once, were his words. A distant thunder echoed, as if the sky itself was responding to the somber confession. Claire deserved better than that, said Rebecca, her voice choked with emotion. She dedicated her life to science, to discovering cures for people like you, Matthew. The golden bromeliad was her great hope for neurological treatments, especially for vision restoration. Matthew remained silent, processing the pain and anger growing inside him. Suddenly he stood up and walked determinedly to the door. Where are you going? Asked Nancy, alarmed. I need air, he replied simply, going out into the night. Outside, the approaching storm had not yet arrived, but the sea wind blew strongly, carrying the unmistakable smell of imminent rain. Matthew sensed Shadow's presence before he even heard his soft whinny. You've been watching over me all this time, haven't you? He murmured to the horse, extending his hand to touch him. He felt the soft, warm coat beneath his fingers, the strong breathing of the animal. A strange sensation of peace invaded him, despite the emotional storm consuming him inside. The door opened behind him, and Ellen's light footsteps approached. He's beautiful, she commented, stopping beside him, black as night, with a small white mark on his chest, shaped like a star. I always imagined what he would look like, replied Matthew. In my dreams he was exactly like this. A moment of silence established itself between them, filled only by the sound of waves and Shadow's occasional soft whinny. I'm sorry about your mother, Ellen finally said. Claire was my older sister, my idol. When I found out what happened, I swore I would make Gilbert pay. I managed to change my appearance, create a new identity, and infiltrate his companies. I spent years gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. And now that moment has come, concluded Matthew. Yes, tomorrow, during the Blue Coast Project launch event, we can expose everything. With Jacob's confession, the video, and the documents proving the tampering of property titles, Gilbert will finally face justice. The first lightning bolt cut across the sky, momentarily illuminating the distant ocean. Day was beginning to dawn, bringing with it a new determination. I don't just want justice, said Matthew, turning toward Ellen. I want to continue my mother's work. I want the golden bromeliad to be studied for its medicinal potential to benefit people like me. Ellen smiled, moved by the strength of this young man who had just discovered the brutal truth about his origins. We'll make that happen, she promised. Together. When they returned inside the house, they found the group gathered around the table, where Rebecca had spread out Claire's maps and notes. The golden bromeliads grow mainly in this area, she explained, pointing to a specific region of the map. Exactly where Gilbert intends to build the hotel complex. It's not a coincidence, commented Diane. He always knew the value of those plants. not just for the land itself, but for the pharmaceutical potential of the discovery. Which could be worth billions, added Rebecca. Imagine a treatment that could restore the vision of people with neurological damage similar to Matthew's. Jacob, who had been silently observing from the corner of the room, approached with difficulty. Gilbert has a meeting with investors at 8 a.m. at the Grand Hotel. The press event starts at 10 on the cliff grounds. He hesitated for a moment. I can help you get in. I know all the security protocols. Matthew shook his head thoughtfully. We won't hide or sneak in, he decided. I'm going to confront him openly. It's time for Gilbert Blackwell to meet the son he tried to eliminate. A respectful silence followed his words. Outside, the first rays of sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a golden light on the agitated sea. A new day was beginning in Harbor Point, and with it, the promise of long-buried truths finally coming to light. At 9:30 in the morning, the event location was bustling with activity. A temporary structure had been set up at the top of the cliffs, with chairs arranged in a semicircle in front of a stage where a large screen displayed the Blue Coast Project logo. Journalists, investors, and important local political figures were already taking their seats, while waiters served champagne in crystal flutes. Gilbert Blackwell, impeccable in his grey suit, personally supervised the final details, effusively greeting each influential person who arrived. At 63, he maintained the haughty posture and calculated smile that had taken him to the top of the business world. Everything is ready, sir, his assistant informed him. The investors are enthusiastic after this morning's presentation. The governor has just arrived and is waiting to make the supportive speech. Gilbert nodded with satisfaction, adjusting his tie in the reflection of his cell phone. Perfect. After 25 years of planning, we'll finally transform this useless piece of rock into the most exclusive resort on the American coastline. On the other side of the venue, partially hidden by a rock formation, the group led by Matthew was watching attentively. Are you sure you want to do this? Asked Nancy, concerned. We can still follow the original plan and just send the evidence to the federal police. Matthew took a deep breath, the silver medallion now visible around his neck. I need to look him in the eyes even if I can't really see him, he replied with determination, not just for me, but for my mother's memory. Rebecca checked the equipment one last time. They had gained access to the event's audiovisual system thanks to a former student of hers who worked for the contracted company. We're ready, she confirmed. As soon as you give the signal, the video will be transmitted on the main screen. And I'll make sure no one interrupts the transmission, assured Ellen, who was wearing the technical team's uniform as a disguise. Remember, we need to be quick, warned Diane. Gilbert has private security, and they won't hesitate to act. Jacob, who was waiting in the strategically parked car for a quick escape if necessary, sent a message. He's going to start his speech in 5 minutes. Matthew adjusted the borrowed jacket from Anthony, feeling the weight of his mother's diary in the inner pocket. Time to restore the truth, he said, taking his first step toward the event. He walked with the discreet aid of a cane, but his posture was firm and confident. Beside him, like a protective shadow unexpectedly appeared, accompanying him at a respectful distance. The security guards at the entrance hesitated when they saw the blind young man approaching, accompanied by the imposing black horse that everyone in the region knew and feared. Sir, you can't enter with that animal, said one of them, blocking the path. Shadow isn't mine. He goes where he wants, Matthew replied calmly. I suggest you don't try to stop him. As if understanding, the horse reared slightly, making the guards step back. The unusual scene was attracting curious looks, and some guests began taking photos. At that moment, Gilbert took the stage and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with immense pride that today we officially launch the Blue Coast Project, the largest tourism development in the history of Harbor Point. Polite applause filled the venue as Matthew slowly advanced down the central aisle, now clearly visible to everyone, including Gilbert, who continued his speech. After years of planning and overcoming numerous obstacles, we will transform These wild cliffs into a luxury paradise that will generate jobs, development, and... His voice faltered as he spotted Matthew. Something about that young man, in his posture, the shape of his face, caused a strange discomfort in Gilbert. And then his eyes caught the medallion. "What is this?" he muttered, momentarily forgetting the microphone was on. "Who are you?" Matthew stopped a few meters from the stage, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the silence that had settled. "My name is Matthew Silver, son of Claire Silver." He paused significantly. "And your son, too, Gilbert Blackwell." Shocked murmurs ran through the audience. Camera flashes fired frantically. Gilbert turned pale, clutching the podium. "This is absurd. Security, remove this imposter." "Imposter?" Matthew smiled slightly. "I'm sure a DNA test would easily confirm my claim. But if you prefer more immediate evidence..." At that exact moment, the screen behind Gilbert changed, displaying the video where he himself ordered the elimination of his own son 25 years ago. His clear and unmistakable voice echoed through the speakers, paralyzing everyone present. "I don't care how you do it, Jacob. That baby needs to disappear." Gilbert turned around horrified, watching his own condemnation being publicly broadcast. The journalists, recovered from the initial shock, eagerly recorded every moment. "Turn that off," he shouted desperately, but it was too late. The video continued, followed by images of the falsified documents and Jacob's signed confession. When the presentation ended, a sepulchral silence dominated the venue. Diane stepped onto the stage, positioning herself beside her son. "It's all true," she confirmed, the pain evident in her voice. "As Gilbert's mother and Matthew's grandmother, I can no longer allow this injustice to continue." Gilbert, cornered, looked around frantically, seeking an escape. His security guards, confused by the situation, awaited orders that didn't come. "You don't understand," he tried, his mask of confidence finally crumbling. "Those lands, the bromeliads, they're worth billions. I was protecting the family's interests. By trying to kill your own son, falsifying documents, covering up the cause of Claire's absence?" questioned Matthew, his voice laden with contained emotion. "What kind of protection is that?" Gilbert, cornered and desperate, did the only thing he still could. He fled. He pushed Diane aside and jumped from the stage, running toward the cliffs. Chaos erupted in the audience when Gilbert dashed toward the cliffs. Security guards, journalists, and guests stood up in confusion while cameras tried to follow the fleeing businessman. Guided by sounds and his detailed memory of the terrain, Matthew followed in the same direction, with Shadow galloping ahead of him. The mysterious connection between man and animal seemed stronger than ever, as if they shared a single purpose. "Matthew, wait! It's dangerous!" shouted Ellen, running after her nephew. But he continued on, his cane abandoned behind him, moving, with surprising agility through the familiar terrain. Years of exploring those cliffs had created a precise mental map in his mind. Gilbert reached the edge of the precipice, the same spot where, 25 years earlier, he had ordered the end of his own son's life. The irony wasn't lost on him as he looked at the turbulent sea below. Behind him, voices and footsteps approached. There was nowhere left to run. When he turned around, he found Matthew standing a few meters away, the sea wind tousling his hair. "How did you manage to follow me?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "I know every rock of this place," replied Matthew. "I've walked here since childhood, guided by the waves, the wind, and Shadow." As if invoked by his name, the majestic black horse appeared beside Matthew, whinnying furiously at Gilbert, who instinctively backed up, dangerously approaching the edge. "That animal," murmured Gilbert, an old memory emerging in his mind. "He was there that night, wasn't he?" "Yes," confirmed Matthew. "Shadow saved me when you tried to eliminate me, and now he's here to witness the moment when the truth finally comes to light." Others were beginning to arrive. Ellen, Rebecca, Diane, and further back, journalists and police officers called to the scene. Gilbert looked around like a cornered animal. "What do you want from me? Money? Recognition? I can give you all that." Matthew shook his head, a surprising calm in contrast to the agitation around him. I don't want anything you can give me. I just want my mother's legacy to be preserved, for the Silver Lands to be protected, for the golden bromeliad to benefit people like me, instead of making the already rich even richer." "You're just like her," said Gilbert, with a mixture of contempt and reluctant admiration. Claire and her ideals, she never understood the real value of what she had discovered. "She understood perfectly," interjected Rebecca, who had approached. "Claire knew that true wealth lay in sharing knowledge, not monopolizing it." Gilbert laughed bitterly. "And look where that got her." "Enough!" Diane's voice cut through the air like a whip. "My son, you have a choice now. Face justice with dignity or continue this futile escape." The wind suddenly increased, bringing with it the smell of the approaching storm. Shadow whinnied again, as loud and furious as on that fateful night 25 years ago. Gilbert looked at the horse, then at the waves breaking on the rocks below, and finally at Matthew. Something in his gaze changed, as if seeing the young man for the first time. Not an obstacle to be removed, but his own son. "You have her eyes," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible under the roar of the wind. Then, to everyone's surprise, Gilbert Blackwell fell to his knees, the weight of decades of guilt finally breaking his resistance. "It's over," he said simply when the police approached to detain him. 6 months later, the cliffs of Harbor Point flourished under the summer sun. In place of the luxury resort, now stood the Clare Silver Institute for Botanical Research, a modern center dedicated to studying local flora, especially the golden bromeliad. In the main laboratory, Rebecca and a team of scientists worked tirelessly, developing the pioneering treatment that Claire had envisioned so many years before. In the treatment room, Matthew underwent the latest session of experimental therapy. "How are you feeling today?" asked Ellen, who administratively coordinated the project. "The same tingling sensation," replied Matthew, as sensors monitored his brain activity. "And yesterday, for a brief moment, I perceived a flash when Rebecca turned on the light." The treatment based on compounds extracted from the golden bromeliad had initiated a slow process of regeneration in his optic nerve. Recovery was gradual, but promising. "Claire would be so proud," commented Nancy, who rarely left her adoptive son's side. In the widely publicized trial, Gilbert Blackwell had been convicted of multiple crimes, including document fraud and the events leading to Claire's death. Jacob, in exchange for his cooperation and confession, had received a reduced sentence and now collaborated with authorities to uncover other corporate crimes. Diane Blackwell, determined to repair her son's mistakes, had donated a large part of her fortune to finance the institute, working side by side with Ellen to ensure that Claire's legacy would benefit as many people as possible. After the treatment session, Matthew asked to go to the cliff. He now walked with more confidence, occasionally catching shadows and indistinct forms, the first signs that his vision was slowly beginning to return. At the top of the precipice, the wind tousled his hair as always, the sound of waves breaking. On the rocks below was a comforting constant. "Do you think he'll appear today?" asked Rebecca, who accompanied him. Shadow was no longer seen as frequently since Gilbert had been taken by the police. The horse appeared occasionally, usually at dawn or dusk, observing from a distance before disappearing again among the rocks. "I'm sure he will," replied Matthew with a serene smile. "Today is a special day." As if answering his call, the sound of hooves approached. Shadow appeared majestic against the horizon, his black silhouette outlined against the orange sunset sky. It was then that it happened. For the first time, Matthew saw more than shadows. The imposing figure of the black horse materialized in his still hazy vision, defined and real, an image he would never forget, his protector, his guardian, under the golden sky that reflected in the crystal waters of Harbor Point. "I can see him," whispered Matthew, tears streaming down his face. "Shadow, I can see him." The horse whinnied softly as if in response, approaching to allow Matthew to touch his muzzle. For a magical moment, man and animal connected in an understanding that transcended words. Then, as if his mission was finally complete, Shadow backed. Up a few steps, whinnied one last time and galloped away, disappearing among the rocky formations of the cliff. Local legends say the black horse was never seen again after that day. Some older fishermen swear that on stormy nights, you can still hear his powerful whinny echoing among the cliffs, a reminder of the guardian that appeared when injustice threatened and remained until balance was restored. As for Matthew, his vision continued to improve gradually. The treatment developed from his mother's research not only helped him, but also brought hope to thousands of people with similar conditions around the world. The cliffs of Harbour Point remained untouched, preserved as natural and scientific heritage, their golden bromeliads blooming freely under the protection of the Clare Silver Institute. And so, where once existed only the ambition of one man, now flourished the dream of a visionary woman, kept alive by the son she never got to know, but who carried within him the same indomitable spirit, like the cliffs that resist time, storms and tides, eternally vigilant before the infinite horizon. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from.